There are crimes that feel impossible because of what happened. And then there are crimes that feel impossible because of what didn't happen afterward. In late 1971, a wealthy neighborhood in Westfield, New Jersey, sat under the soft rhythm of routine: school mornings, commuter trains, church on Sundays. And in the middle of it all stood a big, aging mansion on a hill, the kind of house that makes you slow down as you drive past. Lights glowed inside it night after night. Music played. Nothing looked disturbed. Weeks went by. No one saw the family. When police finally stepped through the door, they found an explanation that was both devastating and baffling, because inside that home, 5 people were dead, and the man responsible had simply disappeared. His name was John List, and the question that haunted investigators wasn't only why he did it. It was how he managed to walk away, calmly, quietly, into a new life that would last nearly 2 decades. If you value long-form investigations that stick to what can be verified, consider subscribing now. This case has one of the most unsettling second lives in true crime, and by the end, we'll follow the trail that finally exposed him, down to the single decision that cracked his disguise. Before we talk about what happened inside that house, we need to talk about the people who lived there. Because true crime can turn human lives into plot points if you're not careful, and that's not what this is. John List's family was, to the outside world, a picture of stability. His wife, Helen, and their children were part of the community. There were school schedules, church commitments, the ordinary friction of a family moving through seasons of life. His mother, Alma, lived with them too, elderly, dependent, and integrated into the household. That's part of what made the discovery so jarring. This wasn't a home that looked like it was falling apart. It wasn't a place neighbors whispered about as troubled. It was a house that, from the street, still looked alive. But inside that family, pressure had been building for a long time. The kind of pressure that doesn't always show up in a driveway or at a church pew. John List worked in accounting and financial roles, jobs that reward precision, control, and routine. He was known as quiet, serious, and deeply religious. And over time, he became the kind of man who didn't just want order in his life, he needed it. Not in the way we casually mean when we say someone likes a clean desk. In the way that becomes rigid, absolute, and dangerous when it's threatened. In the months leading up to the murders, the List family's financial situation had deteriorated. Accounts ran thin, debt mounted. The family's lifestyle, especially living in that large Westfield house, was no longer sustainable. There were reports that John had recently lost his job, and with it, the stability he relied on not just financially, but emotionally and psychologically. And here's where this story gets complicated, because we have to separate what can be confirmed from what comes from John List's own later explanations. It's confirmed that the family was in financial distress. It's confirmed that he murdered 5 family members. It's confirmed that he fled, then lived under a new name for years. What becomes murkier is motive, because motives are often built from a mixture of documented facts, witness recollections, and a killer's own self-serving narrative. According to investigators and later court proceedings, John List framed his actions in religious terms, suggesting he was saving his family from moral decline and hardship. But that framing is something we should treat as his justification, not as insight that excuses or explains. People who commit violence often reach for a story that makes them feel righteous. A question I want you to hold on to, because it will come back in a chilling way, is this: was John List running from consequences, or was he building something he believed he deserved? Because what he did next wasn't frantic. It wasn't chaotic. It was planned. On a day in November 1971, John List began moving through his home the way he always did, quiet, controlled. He didn't act like a man on the verge of losing everything. He acted like a man executing a decision that, in his mind, had already been made. The sequence of events, as reconstructed by investigators, points to a methodical approach. One by one, he killed his wife, his mother, and his 3 children. He used a firearm. He did not call for help. He did not surrender. He did not break down and confess on the spot. Instead, he staged the house to buy time. He left lights on. He set a radio to play, creating the illusion of presence. He wrote letters, one of them to his pastor, attempting to narrate what he had done in a way that sounded less like murder and more like a grim, distorted duty. In those writings, he described financial pressure, personal grievances, and religious reasoning. But again, those words are his. They are not neutral. They are not trustworthy in the way that evidence is. After the killings, he arranged the scene in ways that suggested he wanted control even over what was found later. And then he walked out the front door, locked behind him, and disappeared. If you're listening to this and thinking, how does a man do something that extreme and still have the composure to plan the aftermath? You're not alone. That composure is one of the most disturbing elements of this case. Not because it makes him some mastermind, but because it reveals something colder. He was not acting in a moment of temporary chaos. He was acting in alignment with a decision he'd rehearsed internally. And now the neighborhood becomes part of the story. Because in a place like Westfield, you notice patterns. You notice if someone's car hasn't moved. You notice if curtains never shift. But you also assume the best: vacation, family emergency, visiting relatives. Life gives you 100 normal explanations before it gives you a nightmare. Those lights stayed on. The house sat there, still and quiet. Days became weeks. Eventually, concern turned into a welfare check. Police arrived, expecting something, maybe illness, maybe a domestic dispute, maybe nothing at all. And inside, they found the truth. 5 family members were dead, and John List was gone. The immediate question became straightforward: where is he? But the more investigators looked, the stranger it got. There were signs that he had left intentionally, and that he had prepared for it. He wasn't missing in the usual sense. He had vanished in the way a person vanishes when they have already decided they will not be found. The early investigation moved fast, but it was fighting a problem that is still painfully relevant today. Time. When a suspect disappears immediately, every hour matters. In 1971, the tools investigators had were far more limited than what exists now. No cell phone pings, no digital purchase trails, no instant database cross-checks the way we're used to seeing today. But there were still leads. John List had to leave the house somehow. He had to travel. He had to eat. He had to shelter. And if he planned this, he likely had cash, documents, or a route in mind. Investigators focused on transportation hubs. They looked at the possibility of a train. They examined financial records. They asked, did he withdraw money? Did he take a car? Did he contact anyone? In the first phase of a manhunt, hope is often strangely high. People imagine a quick capture. A tip comes in, a sighting, someone recognizes a face. But then the days stretch. The sightings get less reliable. The trail gets colder, and the manhunt becomes something else, a file that grows thicker, heavier, quieter. Here's what we know from the outcome. John List successfully escaped. He stayed gone for years. So how? The answer sits in a detail that feels mundane until you realize what it means. He didn't run like a cornered man. He traveled like a man starting over. At some point after leaving Westfield, he obtained or used documentation that allowed him to build a new identity. He would eventually live under the name Robert Clark. Under that name, he found work. He joined communities. He attended church. He met people who described him as reserved, polite, ordinary. That's another unsettling truth of this case. If you imagine someone capable of family annihilation as obviously monstrous, you will miss what this story is actually telling you. He blended in because blending in was part of the plan. I want to pause here and ask you something, because this is one of those cases that forces you to confront a difficult reality about human perception. If you lived next door to someone like that, quiet, helpful, consistent, what would it take for you to suspect anything? Drop your thoughts in the comments when you get a chance. Not because the audience can solve this case, we already know the outcome, but because these questions reveal how easily normal can hide what's unthinkable. Back in Westfield, the victim's absence was a wound that didn't close. The community didn't just lose 5 people. They lost their sense of safety in the story they told themselves about where they lived. And the investigators left behind didn't just have a solved crime with a missing suspect. They had a case that challenged them every day with a single humiliation. The killer walked away. As months turned into years, the case became what so many cases become once the headlines fade, something carried by a handful of people who refuse to let it die. Detectives retire. Leads go stale. Witnesses move. The file sits, but it doesn't stop weighing. And then in cases like this, something else happens. A suspect becomes a ghost. John List's face would exist in police bulletins, in old newspaper clippings, in the memories of people who had known him. But faces change. Time reshapes you. A man in his 40s becomes a man in his 60s. Hair thins, skin loosens. The most recognizable parts of you become softer, less defined. That's how fugitives survive time. Time itself becomes the disguise. But the List case had an ingredient that many cases don't: the sheer strangeness of it, the contrast between the setting and the act. The perfect neighborhood story cracked by something horrifying. That contrast kept the case alive in public memory longer than most. Years later, that public memory became the mechanism that finally reached him. By the late 1980s, America had entered a new era of televised crime solving. Shows that invited viewers into investigations, that put faces on fugitives, that turned the living room into an extension of the detective's desk. One of those shows was America's Most Wanted. When John List's case was featured, it wasn't just a recap. It was a strategic strike. They knew the challenge. His face was old. If he was still alive, he likely didn't look like the photographs from 1971. So investigators and producers worked with an artist to do something that sounds almost cinematic, but was grounded in a practical goal: create a likeness of what he might look like now. The artist, Frank Bender, wasn't just guessing. He studied what he could: old photos, descriptions, and the natural ways faces age. He produced a bust, a three-dimensional rendering of John List as an older man. That bust would become the hinge of the case. Because the most dangerous disguise isn't a fake name. It's anonymity. America's Most Wanted aired the story. The bust was shown. The details were laid out: Westfield, the family, the disappearance, the years of silence. And somewhere, someone recognized something. A viewer reportedly saw the image and thought of a man they knew as Robert Clark, a quiet, church-going person, a neighbor, a member of the community, someone who didn't raise alarms until a television show asked the right question. What happened next is the part of the story that feels like the entire country leaning forward at once. A tip came in, authorities followed it, and after nearly 18 years, John List was found living under that assumed identity. If you've ever wondered why public tip lines and televised appeals sometimes matter, this is why. The right person sees the right detail, and a fugitive's carefully built invisibility collapses. John List was arrested in 1989. Think about that timeline. Nearly 2 decades of living as someone else. Nearly 2 decades of ordinary routines built on top of a foundation of violence. That span of time doesn't just represent a failure to catch him sooner. It represents the success of his plan. And once he was in custody, the story shifted into a new phase: accountability. The legal process brought facts into formal shape. The murders were no longer just the nightmare found inside a home. They became evidence, testimony, and judgment. John List faced trial and was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison. Now, if you're listening and feeling an urge to reduce this case to a simple conclusion, he was caught, he was punished, there's a reason it doesn't feel that tidy. Because the weight of what happened doesn't end with a conviction. For the victims, there is no second act, no new identity, no years to rebuild. Their lives ended in that house in 1971. And the world moved on without them. So before we go further into the fugitive years, and we will, because they reveal the mechanics of how someone disappears, I want to return briefly to the victims as people. Helen List was not a character in John's story. She was a human being with her own interior life, her own relationships, her own fears and hopes. The children were not extensions of their father. They were individuals, young people with futures that were never allowed to arrive. The tragedy of family annihilation is that the perpetrator often tries to rewrite everyone else's life as a footnote to his own crisis. He becomes the narrator by force. That's one of the cruelest layers of control. In the years after his capture, some people tried to understand him through the lens of his religiosity, his financial stress, his personality. But explanation is not absolution. Understanding factors is not the same as excusing actions. Here's what we can say with care. Financial stress and personal strain can exist in many lives without leading to violence. What separates John List is not hardship, it's choice. He chose to treat the lives of his family members as something he could end in order to solve his problem. And that reveals something about motive that is often misunderstood. It isn't always rage. Sometimes it's entitlement, quiet, convinced entitlement, where a person believes their need for control outweighs other people's right to live. If you disagree with that, or if you think the religious element is the dominant explanation, I want to hear your perspective. What do you think was the primary engine here? Fear, shame, control, ideology, or something else? Leave a comment with your theory, and tell me what detail led you there. Now let's go back to the disappearance, because this is the part of the case that feels almost like a second crime, the crime of getting away with it. When John List left Westfield, he didn't just vanish physically. He vanished socially. He cut ties. He erased traces. He stepped out of the life that knew his name and into a world where he could be reborn as Robert Clark. And he didn't do it in isolation. A new life requires paperwork, employment, community, and most importantly, people willing to accept you at face value. Under his new identity, he found work, often in environments that valued exactly what he projected: reliability, quietness, competence. He could be the kind of man who didn't cause trouble, who kept his head down, who showed up on time. He also maintained a relationship with church communities. That matters, not because faith causes crime, because it doesn't, but because belonging creates cover. If you are seen every Sunday in the same pew, shaking hands, behaving consistently, people file you away as safe. They stop looking closely. There's a disturbing irony there, because John List had used religious language to rationalize murder, and then used religious community as camouflage. This raises another question that's uncomfortable but important. How often do we confuse quiet with good? The longer he stayed free, the more his freedom reinforced itself. Every year that passed without arrest made it less likely that anyone would connect him to those old photographs from New Jersey. Every new acquaintance who met him as Robert Clark had no reason to suspect John List. They weren't ignoring red flags. They weren't being naive. They simply didn't know they were looking at a man who had already rewritten the rules. And this is where time becomes more than a disguise. Time becomes a shield. As the years passed, the people who remembered the original case aged too. Detectives moved on. Neighbors who might have recognized him relocated or died. Even the cultural memory of the crime softened at the edges. But the case never disappeared entirely, and it didn't disappear for one reason. It had a shape people couldn't forget. A large home, a missing family, a man who left behind a letter as if he were drafting his own epitaph, a fugitive who wasn't seen again. That kind of story becomes a cold case that stays warm. When America's Most Wanted chose to feature it, they were tapping into that lingering unease. They were also leveraging something powerful, collective attention. And when the bust appeared on national television, it created a bridge between the past and the present. It asked viewers not to remember a face from 1971, but to look for a man who might be living down the street right now. That's what closed the distance. The tip that came in was, in a way, the simplest thing. It wasn't a secret confession. It wasn't a hidden fingerprint suddenly found in a file. It was recognition. Someone saw the likeness, compared it to a person they knew, and felt that internal jolt. This can't be true, but what if it is? Imagine being that person for a second. Imagine realizing you may have attended church with a man who had done something like this. Imagine the fear of being wrong and the fear of being right. That moment, right there, is one of the most psychologically intense moments in a case like this, and it almost never gets talked about. If you had made that connection, would you have called it in immediately? Or would you have doubted yourself, worried you were overreacting, told yourself it was impossible? I'm asking because it's easy to say I'd call, but real life is full of hesitation. Leave a comment with your honest answer. What would you do, and what would make it harder? Once authorities had the tip, the investigation accelerated with a kind of urgency that only comes from long-delayed opportunity. A cold case detective's dream is a fresh lead that might finally be real. They verified what they could. They followed the trail. They confirmed the identity. And when they moved in, they arrested him. When John List was confronted with the end of his fugitive life, the mask didn't fall in a dramatic cinematic way. He didn't launch into a wild confession on camera. What stands out in descriptions of him is a continued posture of restraint, still trying, even then, to control the narrative. And in the courtroom, that desire to control collided with something he couldn't outrun anymore: the facts. The trial process placed the victims' deaths back into public record. It forced the community to re-enter the story they'd been trying to leave behind. It forced surviving relatives and witnesses to revisit a chapter that had been left open for years. And John List's explanations, his claims of religious motive, his framing of financial desperation, were measured against the reality of what he had done. A key truth about courtrooms is that they turn stories into evidence. They strip away performance and focus on what can be proven. Whatever John List believed about his own justification, the court found him responsible for murder. He was convicted and sentenced to life. Now there is a moment here where some people feel a kind of relief. The fugitive is caught. The case is closed. Justice, in the legal sense, is served. But emotional closure is different. This case leaves behind questions that don't disappear with a guilty verdict. How does a person live among others for years without being found? How does a community reconcile with the idea that something so extreme can happen in a house they drove past every day? How do we talk about the perpetrator without letting him dominate the story he tried to control? And maybe the hardest question, how do we honor the victims when the public memory of the case is so often built around the killer's disappearance? Part of honoring them is refusing to let the mystery element erase their humanity. Their lives mattered before the crime. They mattered after, too, in the ripples of grief and absence and the way a community remembers. At the same time, the fugitive element of this case does matter, because it teaches us something about the mechanics of evasion that still apply in modern investigations, even with better technology. John List didn't disappear into a jungle or a cave. He disappeared into normality. He took advantage of systems that were less connected then, records that didn't talk to each other, identities that could be patched together more easily, workplaces that didn't have the verification tools we take for granted now. But he also relied on something older than any system, the social instinct to assume the best of people who seem consistent. If you want to understand how fugitives survive time, look at what they cultivate. They don't just hide. They perform reliability. They show up. They keep routines. They don't create drama. They become forgettable on purpose. And John List, by all accounts, was very good at being forgettable. It's tempting to call that intelligence, but I want to be careful with language here. There's a risk in true crime storytelling of accidentally praising a perpetrator's skill, when what we're really describing is manipulation. This wasn't brilliance. This was a calculated exploitation of social trust. He found a new name. He found new communities. He built a new life. And the people around him, who had no reason to suspect what he'd done, offered him the normal gifts of human social life: friendship, fellowship, neighborly respect. And he accepted those gifts while knowing exactly who he was. At about this point in the story, it's natural to feel anger, not just at the original violence, but at the audacity of a second life. So I want to ask you a question that goes beyond why. It's a question about moral psychology. Do you think John List felt guilt during those years? Some people believe he must have, that a person can't live with that kind of secret without it eating them alive. Others believe guilt isn't guaranteed, that a person can rationalize and compartmentalize so completely that the secret becomes just another room in the house they don't enter. What do you think? And what evidence, even indirect, would convince you one way or the other? As we move toward the end of this story, we need to talk about that three-dimensional bust again, because it represents something larger than one artist's work. It represents a bridge between time periods, a method for reaching a fugitive who has aged out of recognition. It's one of the rare moments in true crime where an almost uncanny piece of craftsmanship becomes a functional investigative tool. The bust didn't solve the case on its own, but it did something critical. It helped someone see. It took the idea of John List out of 1971 and dragged it into the present. And that's what led to his capture. If you're finding this investigation meaningful so far, a quick note, right around the midpoint. If you'd like this style of careful, victim-centered deep dive to reach more people, you can hit like. It genuinely helps, and then we'll stay focused on the case. After his arrest, the details of John List's fugitive years became clearer in hindsight. Once you know the ending, you can trace the path backward. But this is another key truth. Most fugitives aren't caught because investigators suddenly become smarter. They're caught because the world shrinks. Time shrinks it. Technology shrinks it. Media shrinks it. Human networks shrink it. John List's world shrank the moment his older face was put on television. When the legal system reached its conclusion, it did what it can do. It imposed a sentence. It recognized the victims in official language. It ended his physical freedom. But even then, there were still unresolved feelings in the public and in the community. Because the kind of crime he committed, murdering one's own family, is a rupture that doesn't heal cleanly. It forces people to interrogate their assumptions about family, about danger, about the meaning of home. A home is supposed to be where you are safest. This home became the opposite. And when something like that happens, it contaminates the idea of safety for everyone who hears the story. That's why this case still lingers. Not because it's entertaining, because it disturbs something fundamental. Now, there's a detail often discussed in cases like this: the letter he left behind. In many family annihilation cases, the perpetrator tries to control the post-crime narrative through writing. Sometimes it's framed as an explanation, sometimes as an apology, sometimes as a list of grievances, sometimes as religious testimony. John List's letter, as it's been described publicly, leaned heavily into justification. He wrote about finances, about religion, about what he perceived as moral decline. In other words, he wrote the story he wanted others to read. But letters like this have a pattern. They often reveal more through what they refuse to acknowledge than through what they say. They talk about the perpetrator's feelings, the perpetrator's shame, the perpetrator's fear, and they minimize the victims as independent lives. In a sense, the letter becomes part of the crime. It's an attempt to have the last word. So here's a question that matters ethically in how we tell these stories. How do we discuss the perpetrator's words without giving them the last word? The answer, I think, is to treat those words as evidence, not as truth. We can acknowledge what he claimed while remembering that he was a man who had just committed murder. His narrative was not neutral. His framing was a tool. And in the decades since, that framing has sometimes influenced the way people discuss the case, focusing on finances and religion and stress, as if those forces acted on him rather than him acting on others. But stress doesn't pull a trigger. Belief doesn't force murder. A person chooses. That doesn't mean we stop analyzing. It means we analyze honestly. So if we analyze John List, what do we see? We see a man who valued control, who feared humiliation, who faced financial collapse, and who appears to have interpreted that collapse not as a problem to endure, but as a threat to his identity. We see a person who, rather than accept loss, chose annihilation. And we see planning. Planning is what separates a sudden act from an orchestrated one. Planning is what allowed him to stage the house. Planning is what allowed him to move into a new identity quickly. Planning is what allowed him to live. And that's the part that's hardest to sit with, because it feels like he got what he wanted for a long time. In the years after his capture, the case became a reference point in conversations about fugitives, identity, and public assistance in investigations. It's often cited as a major example of how media exposure can lead to capture. But if we only tell it that way, we risk making it a story about the chase rather than the loss. So I want to do something here that we don't always do in true crime. I want to sit in the aftermath for a moment. Imagine the ripple effect in Westfield. The sudden realization that a family you recognized, people you might have nodded to at church or waved to at school, were gone. And then the fear that the person who did it was out there. Imagine the investigators who carried that file through years of dead ends. Imagine the relatives who had to live with unanswered questions, then reopen everything when he was caught. That emotional labor doesn't end with an arrest. And for the victims, Helen, Alma, and the children, the justice system can only do so much. It can punish, it can name wrongdoing, but it cannot restore what was taken. This is also why we should be careful with language like closure. Many families have said closure is a myth. What they get sometimes is an answer, a verdict, a sentence, but the grief remains. So where does that leave us at the end of this story? It leaves us with a case that is solved in the legal sense, but still unresolved in the human sense. It leaves us with a warning about how easily a person can blend in when a community equates stability with safety. It leaves us with a demonstration of how public attention can sometimes do what traditional investigation cannot, especially in an era before interconnected databases. And it leaves us with a moral question that doesn't have a satisfying answer. What kind of person can do this, then go on to live quietly among others? If you've listened this far, you've been sitting with heavy material, and I appreciate the care that takes. Before we wrap, I want to ask one final comment question, one that isn't about speculation but about meaning. What do you think this case teaches, if anything, about the stories we tell ourselves about good families, safe neighborhoods, and people we think we know? Because if there's a lasting lesson here, it may be this: evil doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it blends into routine. Sometimes it wears a suit, holds a steady job, and shakes your hand at church. And that's not meant to create paranoia. It's meant to create honesty, about the limits of perception, about the fact that we do not truly know what lives behind someone else's closed door. John List was convicted and sentenced to life. His fugitive years ended. His ability to control the narrative ended in a courtroom, where evidence mattered more than the story he wrote about himself. But the victim's story deserves to be remembered beyond the headline of his disappearance. They were a family with lives that mattered. Their absence mattered. The impact of their loss is part of the story, too. If you're new here and you want more long-form investigations told with respect and restraint, focused on what can be verified, and centered on the people harmed, consider subscribing at the end of this video. There are other cases like this where the public memory is shaped by the wrong person, and part of what we do here is shift the focus back where it belongs. And if you want to keep going, I'd recommend watching another case where a killer's second life lasted for years, because comparing them side by side reveals patterns that are both instructive and unsettling. For now, thank you for listening carefully. And most of all, take a moment to hold space for the people at the center of this: Helen, the children, and Alma, whose lives were not footnotes, and who deserved far more time than they were given.